Everybody, it's an honor to be with you here at Anomicon 2024. I'm honored to have been asked to be a speaker at this event. Really looking forward to hearing what others have to say. But for now, my name is Aleksandar Petakov. I'm a filmmaker, adventurer, outdoorsman, do a lot of stuff in the cryptozoology and mystery documentary world. You might be familiar with some of my work through Small Town Monsters. I produce a number of documentary series with Small Town Monsters, such as Bigfoot Beyond the Trail, as well as Strange Places, which I'm going to be talking about today. So a few other ones as well, and I've worked on a bunch of other Small Town Monsters productions as well. So without further ado, let's get right into my presentation. So what makes a place so strange? This is an examination of strange places. We'll start out with the definition of the word strange: unusual, unexpected, or difficult to understand. Those of us that are familiar with the paranormal world, obviously you hear the word strange a lot. I don't think a lot of people think about what the actual core meaning of it is. So when it comes to my documentary series, Strange Places, which I launched earlier this year in 2024, it's pretty straightforward. Strange place, right? There's not a lot to it. I'll get into some of the thematics about what makes a place strange. I have a little bit perhaps of a broader definition than maybe other folks do in terms of what I'm including, but we'll highlight a bunch of locations. But to start out with, one genre or a theme that I'm heavily exploring and utilizing in Strange Places is urban exploration, or urbex. Now this is something that's become very popular over the last few years online. It's been popular for quite a long time. I mean, some would even consider archaeology a form of urbex, perhaps in antiquated times. But in a modern context, you're exploring abandoned structures, infrastructures. Oftentimes that includes secret facilities, military installations, that sort of thing. That'll play a part in some of the locations I talk about a little later. But for example, this is a picture of me exploring very recently when I was in Croatia, what's called the Željava Air Base, which was one of the largest underground military installations in all of Europe, formerly in Yugoslavia, which no longer exists. But this was an underground base that housed jet fighters, so there were up to 60 fighter pilot planes that could fit inside the base here, and this doorway I'm standing in is where the jets would have came through. So this is an example of one that's been abandoned now for about 30 years, since the Yugoslav civil wars. It's a location that you'd consider to be an urbex location. Now we have dark tourism and morbid curiosity. And keep in mind, some of these themes, they sort of merge and can be interchangeable in a lot of places. So dark tourism and morbid curiosity. Dark tourism, places of death or tragedy. So think about a lot of people visiting battlefields or even concentration camps, places where there's been heavy tragedy, maybe out of curiosity or out of mourning. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people visit these locations, but I think there's definitely an attraction. We have a very morbid curiosity, again, where tragedies happen. For example, I have one of the pictures here is it's an ossuary church, actually, in the Czech Republic, in a place called Kutna Hora, and it's actually a bone church. The inside of the church is decorated with thousands of bones and skulls and skeletons of people who died of the Black Plague. Very kind of creepy, weird, morbid vibes. I actually got kind of physically ill while visiting this location, but it's one of the most visited places in all of the Czech Republic, or Czechia as they're now called. And then we have visiting dangerous locations. So adrenaline junkies, things that you kind of are on the edge of danger. Perhaps there's a mortality there. Caves, very tight places like that, such as this tunnel pictured here. And I also consider post-humanity and apocalyptic landscapes to be part of this kind of dark tourism. So we visit a lot of these abandoned locations because perhaps it can give us a window into how the world would look in a post-human sense. If all of a sudden human civilization was to end today, what would it look like? I think we have a fascination with that. There's a reason why so many of our religions, pop culture, throughout human history, we've been obsessed with the apocalypse, with Armageddon, the end of the world, whether it be through giant floods or natural disasters, nowadays nuclear war, and that's been a theme for a long time. I think there's a definite fascination we have. Some of these abandoned places, in my opinion, give us a sort of view into, let's say our civilization was to end today, come back 20 years later, 30, 50, 100 years later, what would it look like? Nature would begin to reclaim it. So I think there's an element of that. We also got window or flap areas. This is kind of where high strangeness is compounded. Now, you don't have to be a believer of this to kind of accept the terminology. I'm just illustrating these sort of regions that are out there. So you have stuff like the Bermuda Triangle, we're all very familiar with, an area where there's a lot of tragedy associated with strange anomalous weather or mystery occurrences. And of course you have something like the Bridgewater Triangle, named sort of after the Bermuda Triangle, popularized by Loren Coleman, a world-famous cryptozoologist. And the Bridgewater Triangle is a kind of paranormal smorgasbord where a lot of strange things are reported in one place. You have ghost stories, UFOs, haunted locations, Native American curses, cryptid creatures, Bigfoot, black dogs, strange winged creatures, all seen in the same sort of place. Obviously, it's not just a triangle, but that's sort of, it's easy for us to understand what a triangle is. It's neatly packaged. Some of these areas, some of these strange places are kind of window or flap areas. Now, this merges into urban legend, however. So urban legend includes a lot of different topics. You have, of course, famous hauntings, locations, such as in the Bridgewater Triangle with, you know, some of the murders that have happened there, Freetown Forest, some of the cult activity. It's kind of taken on an urban legend status. You've also got things like cryptids. So some of the examples I have here, we've got the Mothman of Point Pleasant. So Point Pleasant, West Virginia is very well and closely associated with the Mothman lore and legend. You've also got places like the Bell Witch Cave here pictured, which is a cave in which the Bell Witch, famous case in Tennessee, one of the most famous witching cases after the Salem witch trials, perhaps, in terms of the United States, in Adams, Tennessee. So you've got that cave that's associated with that legend. Miracles, magical occurrences, these are all kind of tied into urban legend. And again, you don't have to believe in any of these things to just admit, you know, hey, there are urban legends. I mean, you can say, yes, the Pine Barrens of New Jersey are said to house the Jersey Devil. Does that mean you believe in it? Not necessarily. It just, you're talking about an urban legend. We've also got liminal spaces. Now, liminal spaces are a little bit harder to define, but from my understanding, they're sort of transitionary spaces. There's some places between a destination, hallways, train stations, places that sort of make people kind of uncomfortable. It's almost like an uncanny valley in a physical sense, in a space. So this is an example of one in an abandoned location. Abandoned liminal spaces seem to be kind of creepy, and there may be a connection again while we're fascinated. This connects perhaps into dark curiosity, stuff I was talking about earlier. So now I'm going to talk about and break down some of the locations I've covered, and they fall again into those various categories. We have regions, so like a flap area type stuff. We have specific locations tied to one location where maybe some strange history has taken place. And we'll kind of get into all that in the locations I cover. But this is just a map of some of the places so far I've covered in this series. I've got about 7 or 8 episodes. I believe it's 7 as of count. I mean, there's so many of them, it's hard for me to even keep track of. But there are a few that I'm going to talk about as well that aren't yet out in terms of episode. So in terms of an episode, so you guys will be able to hear about those towards the end of the presentation. We'll start out with one, controversial. Definitely hinges a lot on urban legend, a little bit of dark tourism, some urbex as well. We've got the land between the lakes on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. This is actually a national recreation area. It's a massive area. As you can see on the map here, it's the largest inland peninsula, I believe, in the United States, and it borders Kentucky and Tennessee. And it has a very kind of tragic history. It was not naturally formed. It was formed by the usage of eminent domain to seize land from people that had lived there. Now, this land had been previously seized from the Native Americans, so there's a lot of kind of suffering that's compounded in the area. But in the 20th century, when the land was seized by the federal government for use with the Tennessee Valley Authority, it was then turned into a recreation area. There was a lot of resentment and bitterness that kind of clung to what had happened there with the eminent domain and the land seizure, and people were basically cleared out of the area. So this is a little bit of visual of what it looks like. Now, the land between the lakes now has become very infamous, almost in an internet creepypasta sense. So this is hinging very heavily on urban legend. But if you Google or search on YouTube land between the lakes nowadays, what you'll most likely come across is something to do with the topic of dogman or a werewolf canine-like creature. Allegedly, there was a massacre that took place in the 1980s in which a family was killed by one of these dogmen creatures in the land between the lakes. It's a big if, right? I mean, it's a story that, frankly, I'm very skeptical of. But for some reason, that story, at some point, was attached to the land between the lakes, and that is stuck. And now it's become an area that a lot of people go to, claim to have these encounters. So it's a kind of an interesting cultural creation, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, what the reality is behind it. But the land between the lakes seems to attract these sorts of stories. And this story in particular, I don't know if it hinges on a little bit of some dark tourism, place where people allegedly were massacred. That is somewhere where people want to go and explore and try to find the location. There's a lot of people who have thought of, oh, this is where it happened, or that's where it happened. So again, it's hinging very heavily on urban legend. You also have the element of that urbex, as I talked about. Throughout the land between the lakes, there are abandoned structures, such as this one, formerly a boat captain's house, nicknamed Hotel California now, completely abandoned. You have houses and cemeteries all throughout the land between the lakes that were there from when people lived there before they were forced off. So you have that element where you can be exploring in what looks like some desolate woods and come across a structure or what's left of a home or an old homestead. So I think you have a combination of factors that make the LBL a strange place. You've got, of course, the more modern Dogman story, that sort of stuff, allegedly Bigfoot stories, other kind of weird occurrences. Then you also have what I learned about while I was at the LBL, which is very interesting, the Vampire Hotel. I was told, hey, do you want to go visit the Vampire Hotel? I said, what is the Vampire Hotel? Well, apparently it's an area where this sort of LARPing kind of cult, the vampire cult, out of Murray, Kentucky, which you can see on the map there, used to do some kind of role-playing or rituals in the LBL. I mean, the story has kind of taken off a little bit. Nobody's really sure what exactly happened, but apparently there was a real location that was an abandoned house of some sort in the LBL that was then used by a group of people alleged to be a sort of cult, vampire cult. And it culminated in the leader of this cult going to Florida and actually killing 2 people. And it caused a sort of hysteria in that part of Florida. You can see one of the newspaper titles, Trial of Teen Vampire Killer May Expose Wide Cult Circle. Small town possessed by vampire murders, Tavares, Florida. So this had nothing to do with the LBL, the murders themselves. This group, this sort of guy who thought he was this reincarnated vampire, used to just lurk around the LBL, or he would do rituals there. That's where the story is unclear. But after these murders happened in the late 90s, they actually demolished that hotel, the Vampire Hotel, the building that was there. And you can still visit now, but there's really nothing to see other than a foundation. There's not a lot there. So it's a very interesting story. Before we move on from the LBL, just wanted to say, yeah, this again, there's multiple pieces to the puzzle here when it comes to the land between the lakes. You don't just have the Dogman stories. I found when I was there, a lot of people tend to want to cover that Dogman element, right? That's maybe, now again, it's kind of the creepypasta stuff that we're into, a little bit of that urban legend. But I found when I went there, it was very interesting to hear the other stories or other crimes and criminal activity and allegedly people missing there, the vampire murders. I mean, all this stuff, vampire cult, this all fascinated me. And that's the reason why actually it was my first ever episode of Strange Places. I felt that it's this sort of window flap area where there allegedly is a lot of different phenomena going on. And you have this huge influence from the internet world in terms of a lot of the creepypasta stuff and that urban legend, and it all compounded. And you don't have to believe in anything that happened there at the LBL. There were real things that happened, real crimes. People have died out there. These vampire cult people apparently were out there. Again, you don't have to believe in any of this stuff, but it doesn't mean the land between the lakes is not a strange place. I think it categorizes that. For some reason, this area is attached to the constant stories of dogmen, and that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. It could be a complete fictional creation of the human mind, so be it, but it is still attached to this one particular area for one reason or another, and I think that's why it lands it solidly into a truly strange place. So now moving on to my number 2 kind of location, we have these abandoned fortresses along the Mississippi River in South Louisiana. This is somewhat dark tourism, a little bit more urbex, historical exploration. This is actually one of the 2 forts there. There's these 2, and I'll explain a little bit more of the context why I found them unusual. This is Fort Jackson, actually named after President Andrew Jackson. And this is a map that shows you the mouth of the Mississippi River, which is arguably the most important river in American history. It's certainly played such a huge role in the 1800s, the creation of America, and kind of the country that we know nowadays, especially the Midwest and that whole region. And where these forts are happens to be very close to the mouth of the Mississippi, where it empties out into the Gulf of Mexico, and about 60-ish miles from New Orleans, which is to the left there. So that's where the forts are. And what we have is 2 fortresses across the way. So you have Fort St. Philip and Fort Jackson. I'm not going to talk a lot about Fort Jackson. It was created later. Fort St. Philip is arguably the more interesting and unusual, in my opinion, of the 2 fortresses, because Fort St. Philip started out actually as a Spanish fortress when Louisiana was part of the Spanish Empire. Then traded hands to the French, who took it over. It was Fort San Felipe before, when it was Spanish. Then it became Fort St. Philip. Eventually, Louisiana becomes part of the United States, so the Americans take it over. It becomes Fort St. Philip. So this fortress is one of the most historic old fortresses in the United States. It's been in multiple wars, a lot more than most fortresses. It was in the War of 1812 with the British, the crucial Battle of New Orleans, played a crucial defense in kind of keeping the British at bay. Fort St. Jackson was added afterwards, after the War of 1812, President Andrew Jackson. During the Civil War, both of these forts were used by the Confederacy as the main defense of New Orleans. The Confederates lost the battles of Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, and thus the Union was able to capture New Orleans in 1862, which was the largest city in the Confederacy at the time. Very costly for the Confederacy. So these 2 forts played kind of an integral role in that early American history in the War of 1812 and the Civil War. And Fort St. Philip then would have a very interesting kind of fate. Both of the fortresses would continue to be used and were outfitted in World War I as well, possibly. Actually, during the Spanish-American War, I should say, they were outfitted then as well, used as some training grounds in World War I. And then their strategic value was sort of lost. Fort Jackson just kind of is on the side. You can see with this satellite map, Fort Jackson is on the side where there's road access, whereas Fort St. Philip is very tough to get to. And Fort St. Philip then in the mid-1900s was actually used as, I've heard it described as a concentration camp, possible internment camp. Into the civil rights era in the 1960s, there was a parish president there in Plaquemines Parish, which is the location of both of these fortresses. And he wanted to round up Martin Luther King Jr. and a lot of his supporters and throw them into this internment camp, which Fort St. Philip was basically turned into a kind of prison. It never ended up happening. That's just another piece of the history there of Fort St. Philip. Then in the 70s and 80s, a group that's been described as a cult, the Vela Ashby commune, lived in the fort, and they had some kids there. They were kind of a somewhat quasi-religious cult. There's really not a lot known about them, but they were there until the leader of the cult, who I believe called himself kind of an anointed one, he passed away, and the whole group sort of fell apart. So since basically the 80s, that fortress has been entirely abandoned. This is the area that we're talking about, South Louisiana. Just absolutely feels like the end of the earth, by the way, when you're down there. You're in areas that are being reclaimed by the Gulf of Mexico. Very little dry land there. And here's just another map exhibiting the positions of the 2 fortresses in the Mississippi River. Again, a very crucial area. Many historical battles, of course, as we talked about. And this is what's currently left of Fort St. Philip there. It's almost like, looks like an Indiana Jones set. This is a drone shot I got flying over the base. It's in private hands, but I don't think it should be lost to the impact how unusual it is that one of the most historic forts in U.S. history, a Spanish fort that became a French fort, that then became an American fortress, that was used in the War of 1812, then became a Confederate fortress, was used during the Civil War, then was used in the Spanish-American War, then was turned into basically an internment camp, then was the host of a cult that lived there. So it's been in use for hundreds of years for one reason or another, whether it's a cult or the Confederacy. It doesn't matter. It's been used and utilized, and now for the last 40, 50 years it's been completely abandoned, and it looks like an Indiana Jones set. Actually seeing inside the fortress there with just desolate. I just found that very unusual and intriguing that this historic fortress was in such a state, and very few people know about it. I actually coincidentally learned about it, and it's very hard to get to because it's on a side of the Mississippi with no road access as opposed to Fort Jackson, so you can really only get over there via boat. And it's in private hands now, so it's very hard to actually get into and observe, but it is a very fascinating location. And these two fortresses in such a historic area along the Mississippi, I thought were a solid addition to Strange Places and really piqued my interest as somebody as much as a lover of history as I am. All right, moving on. We've got apocalyptic Pennsylvania. So this was a little bit of a combination of a few locations, very heavily hinging on urbex. Because I visited 3 locations and I put them into one film about these locations, Pennsylvania was a state that had a lot of industry back in the day. There was a lot of coal mining, the Industrial Revolution, a lot of iron production, just a very, very populated, very busy state in the late 1800s and certainly into the 20th century as well. This location actually pictured here is called Concrete City in Nanticoke, Pennsylvania, just outside of the Scranton-Wilkes Barre area. And it's former housing for a coal processing colliery plant with these sort of bizarre concrete houses that were set up in these formations. You can see here's a closer picture of the modern look of them, and they were abandoned they were abandoned in the 1920s. So they've been abandoned for over 100 years now, and this is the abuse they've taken in that time since then. And it's just a very fascinating location to see, just very eerie visiting there. As I talked about earlier, one of the themes being the post-apocalyptic landscape. What would it look like if we just ceased to exist and you visited a location where humanity lived afterwards? And I thought this location really exhibited that. You know, what would a housing development look like? As we can see with this picture, what would that kind of look like? How long would it take? Obviously, these are made of concrete, so they've fared somewhat well in 100 years. Of course, they're probably won't last another 100 years, but all in all, interesting to see. The second location is the Pennsylvania Turnpike Tunnel. So it's a couple of sections of the Pennsylvania Highway Turnpike system that were abandoned, turned into these tunnels. There's actually been a post-apocalyptic movies filmed here before, like the movie The Road with Viggo Mortensen, a very disturbing movie. It's a great movie, but they filmed a pretty interesting scene of it here at these tunnels, because this is a sort of infrastructure. All these highways, these transport systems we have, what would they look like if they were abandoned? They would look like this, a very creepy location to visit, very strange, very odd. Normally you drive through tunnels. There are plenty of tunnels in Pennsylvania today you can drive through just like this that are in operation. You don't think anything of it. But visiting one that's been out of commission since the 1960s, it just has an eerie feeling. And that is what we got while visiting the tunnels here. As you can see the inside of the tunnel, you've got water leaking everywhere. It just shows that our engineering feats that we carve through mountains or tame the land, nature still finds a way to kind of crawl back. So visiting the tunnel, a very interesting and creepy experience. And again, it's kind of, you wonder why. Why is it creepy? Why is it weird? Why is it intriguing? It's a little bit of that morbid curiosity. It's a little bit of that post-apocalyptic vibe that we get with this obsession with the end of the world. And this gives us a sort of glimpse into that. This is the highway actually leading up to one of the tunnels there. There's 2 tunnels that are actually, you can visit, and there's a highway in between that connects them. And the third location was a paper mill, actually, that was involved in multiple floods that had happened in northern Pennsylvania, a place called Austin. And this is kind of an exterior shot above the paper mill. You know, we have plenty of factories, plenty of manufacturing around the world. What would happen if one of them just natural disaster or apocalypse would cease to exist? Might look a little bit like this. And just kind of intriguing to visit. Again, unusual. Some people might not be that creeped out. Others may be very creeped out by a location like this. Water everywhere. You have stalactites growing from the ceiling in certain places, just really showcasing what Mother Nature can do in even less than 100 years. These were some kind of processing chutes for the pulp or something that had to do with the mill. I don't exactly know, but it gave me that sort of liminal space, weird sort of feeling while I was there. So that's Apocalyptic Pennsylvania. That kind of covers that aspect of why are we so obsessed with these abandoned locations? Even if they don't have any weird stories attached to them, they are just weird on their own. Now, this connects into that. We're going to talk about a haunted, abandoned anthracite mine in Pennsylvania. This is certainly dark tourism, urbex, urban legend, all kind of wrapped into one. This is one of the coal mine chutes there, as you can see, with somebody at the end. I took this picture while we were in there. So we should just say, Pennsylvania, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about the industry there, heavy industry. It was home to one of the earliest coal mining regions in the U.S. and one that's still in use to this day from the 1700s on. And it's actually one of the purest forms of coal found on Earth, which is called anthracite coal. I've got a piece of it actually right here on my desk. I don't know if you can see that. I'll try to hold it up to the camera. It's one of the purest forms of coal. And the industry was particularly brutal in this part of Pennsylvania. Up to 37,000 people died, violent deaths in the mines. That's not including of anthrosilicosis or black lung, that sort of stuff from long-term coal exposure, just violent deaths inside the mines, being crushed by a mine cart, being crushed by a mule that would be in the mines, a shaft collapsing and killing dozens of people. This was a very regular occurrence for hundreds of years in this region of Pennsylvania. This photo here shows mostly young European immigrant boys that would have worked in the mines. You had children as young as 6 or 7 working in the mines in abysmal, appalling conditions. So, brings it to the exploration part. So, there are hundreds of these coal mines peppered across Pennsylvania, especially in this anthracite region, which I should say is northeast Pennsylvania, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, that area. It's called the anthracite region, actually. There's hundreds of these mines everywhere. And there are sort of groups of people that go and explore some of these. It's a little bit of a gray area if they're allowed to or not, and it can be somewhat dangerous. So maybe there's a little bit of that adrenaline junkie sort of human need to explore, even if it may cost you your life. But I was lucky enough to get involved with a group of these people that explore some of these mines, and they took us to one in particular that had been the scene of quite a bit of tragedy. There had been some miners' deaths there, just brutal kind of collapses. As I mentioned, it was just a brutal industry, and this is us traversing in one of the mines there, and you can see the old mine cart track. And I say haunted abandoned anthracite mine because these guys, they explore these mines. They're not really into the ghost stuff. They don't do the paranormal stuff. But they have this urban legend that they call the Tommy Knocker. Now that is something that actually comes over from the UK. Welsh miners talked about Tommy Knockers. So anything weird that would happen in a mine, if it was something got moved or something unusual happened, it was blamed on the Tommy Knocker. And that is described as this small sort of almost like an evil leprechaun, little gnome creature that lives in the mine and causes, like a gremlin, causes mayhem and mischief. Now, this has sort of been adopted in this Pennsylvania region as well for any kind of alleged ghost stuff. Oh, that's just the Tommy Knockers. So it's a very interesting old story that's translated into the modern era. I mean, some of these mines were mined, these deep coal mines were used up until the 60s and 70s. Now there's very few of them, mostly strip mining, which is surface mining, because of how dangerous these deep mines are. But while we were actually in this one mine, we had a couple times where something in the same spot, like rocks being moved around, got shifted around, and it really kind of threw us off a little bit. And the guys we were with said, we've been to hundreds of these mines. We almost never have this kind of stuff happen. But in this one particular mine, this is where it happens. So that's why we thought it was sort of unusual. But these mines are incredible. They're like a time capsule. You have equipment that was left the day of guys were working. They left some of their stuff. They go home for the day. The mine shuts down. All the stuff they had in there is left. paperwork. I mean, we had paperwork going back to the 40s you could look into. All this stuff sort of laying around, really just kind of frozen in time. You can see one of the shafts going down to a flooded air tunnel, actually. And this was mule stalls. They used to have mules in the mines before a lot of the mechanized machinery. They had mules, and these mules were known to be murderous. They would actually sometimes kill miners if they were whipping them too much or kind of hassling them too much, and they'd crush people against the side of the mine. Talk about scary, right? So they used to bribe them with pieces of food or pieces of their dessert just to keep the mules on their good side. Knowing how many humans and animals suffered underground in these conditions really was sort of sobering, and how this is really just under the surface. These subterranean realms, which in this case, a lot of these are right under downtown Scranton, Pennsylvania, or other parts of Pennsylvania, side of a mountain. You may look at it and say, oh, it's a mountain, but there may be 5 mines that are all interconnected in that one mountain. I mean, it's unbelievable to think about how this is all just really hidden under the surface. And these worlds that these people toiled in, very unusual. You can see some of that sort of really, the water there, just the chemicals, everything. This is really interesting. Another air chute that very creepy, like a portal to hell looking thing. And you have these sort of stalactites hanging in the ceiling. So I thought it was a very interesting topic to cover for Strange Places. I'm glad I did a exploration of these mines. Certainly was, a little bit scary getting in there and crawling through some of these tight spaces and getting into these mines. It's somewhat similar to cave exploration, but so much different because, this is not natural. This wasn't formed by nature. This is humans extracting a precious resource at an incredible human cost, I might add. And then some of the weird stuff we had happen. Next location, probably one of my favorite I've covered in this series so far. One of my top locations I've ever visited, actually. It's the North Concord it's the North Concord Air Force Radar Station, also known as the Lyndonville Air Force Radar Station, changed names. So this is urban exploration, probably one of the coolest places, and you have urban legend, and we'll get into that a little bit. So what is the North Concord Air Force Station? That's what I'll refer to it as because of the two-name kind of situation. So it was actually a Cold War era radar tracking facility during the height of the Cold War, late 1950s and the early 60s. You had, of course, mutually self-assured destruction with the Soviet Union, with the U.S. and its allies. These radar posts all across North America and other parts of the world to monitor potential aerial attacks or nuclear attacks coming from the Soviet Union. And this location, the North Concord Air Force Station, is in northern Vermont, very close to the Canadian border, very close to the state of New Hampshire as well, my home state. And these were basically, as you can see the little domes there, the radars were inside the domes on top of these towers. So you can see some of us standing on the towers there, and that's where the radar units would have been back in the day. Now, the North Concord Air Force Station was only in operation from 1956, I believe, to 1962, and it was decommissioned. A very short time period. It became very costly to maintain, but it was part of this overall defense that was taking place in the U.S. with threats from the Soviets. And it was chosen to be put on a very remote mountain called East Mountain in northern Vermont in the middle of nowhere. And you can see actually in this drone shot just how dramatic of a landscape it is around there. I mean, it's very sci-fi in appearance. It looks like something out of Star Wars or Fallout, secret rebel base. Here's another close-up of it. You can see there were originally 5 towers. The one in the middle, I believe, was never actually used. I could be wrong on that, but towards the end of the base's lifespan, it was renamed the Lyndonville Air Force Station very soon before it was closed, actually. And so they were trying to update the radar systems, and they didn't end up actually completing it entirely. So you have this middle tower that happens to be the tallest one that I believe was never in use, whereas the other ones were. Here's just an overview picture, as you can see. I mean, it was an impressive facility. Just the view around there, absolutely unbelievable. You camp there on one of the towers. I mean, talk about exploring a cool place. Such a really interesting history, and we'll get into some of the really interesting history because this place ties into UFO history quite significantly, in my opinion. There's a view from that top tower. Actually, you can just see how you can see into Canada. You can see into New Hampshire. You have when the weather's clear, just 360 panoramic views. Some of the best views in all of northern New England, which is a very mountainous area. You'd have to get to the top of a place like Mount Washington or something along those lines to get a view akin to this. There's still a lot of old equipment and machinery left, and unfortunately with a lot of these abandoned locations, vandals often get there and destroy them and have their way with them, and that's just an unfortunate reality of when these places become known. They become targets of vandalism and bored teens and destruction and theft, so they don't last very long. I mean, this place has been abandoned since the 60s. It's now been over 60 years, and the structures are pretty much the only thing that's really left there in any quantity. This is a view from one of the towers there. I mean, just absolutely unbelievable views and all that. Again, it just gave me some sort of Star Wars kind of sci-fi vibes. This beautiful pictures. This was the view there at night. So part of it was, I believe it was about 170 service members were stationed there, but you had a lower base, and this is a picture of the lower base. So this is on the mount. This is beneath the mountain. This is where they would have been housed and lived. They even had a bowling alley apparently there. This was a gym. You can still visit that there at the lower base, and it's about 2 miles up a paved road to get to the actual upper part of the base. More kind of indoor. A lot of just destruction, weather. Brutal northern New England climate over the years has taken its toll in this location. Now, what's fascinating is you have one of the most famous UFO abduction cases in history, arguably one of the first really well-known cases, the Betty and Barney Hill encounter, incident, however you want to call it, September 19th, 1961. So that is something very well documented. The story is well known. That took place in northern New Hampshire in the White Mountains, Franconia Notch area, allegedly where the abduction happened, missing hours. Now what's very fascinating is you have Project Blue Book, which is a government, I believe it was the third iteration of the government at the time, studying UFOs, or UAPs as we might call them now, unknown aerial phenomena and that sort of stuff. And they took thousands of reports from across the U.S., and there actually were two from the North Concord facility. One happened in, I believe, early 1960 or 1961. Gosh, I can't remember the exact date, but it was a service member at the lower base there seeing something from the mess hall that kind of was sort of looked like a comet or something, and I believe it was observed in other places. Project Blue Book was pretty skeptical of these sightings, but they wrote it off as sort of just a sort of like the meteor or something like that was seen. Now, the more interesting one is this one right here, this Project Blue Book file, which happens to be from the 19th of September, 1961, in which a relative low speed and high altitude object was observed on radar, tracked on radar for 18 minutes. It was tracked on radar, had a very erratic movement. So we can see in the report, a return on HF radar, size of aircraft appearing, normal target at 62,000 feet, appeared at 196 degrees at 84 miles, lost contact at 199 degrees at 80 miles. Going northwest, then south, gradually south on scope 18 minutes. So on scope for 18 minutes. And they concluded it was traveling at a relative low speed, high altitude, coupled with erratic course, including hovering, indicate target was probably high flying weather balloon. That's what Project Blue Book assumed. Now, sure, that could be possible. Weather balloon maybe moving around in erratic fashion. But what's very interesting about this report is that this happened a mere few hours before the Betty and Barney Hill incident, which again took place September 19th, 1961. Timeline-wise, the radar tracking sighting happened only a few hours before the incident there in New Hampshire. So this is a map of where you can see the North Concord Air Force Station, Franconia Notch, where Betty and Barney Hill were alleged to have their encounter. It's only about 30-ish air miles. You can easily see Franconia Notch, which is a sort of notch in the mountains there, in which the road passes through. You can see it from the North Concord facility when you're up on the radar tower. So for an aircraft, 30 air miles is really not that big of a deal. Very close by. So it's just very interesting, I find intriguing, and maybe just a tangential connection, that the same night as allegedly the most intriguing and well-known UFO abduction case in history, arguably, Betty and Barney Hill case, is corroborated by a UFO reported at a government facility very close by, had erratic movement. They again rationalized it away as a air balloon, which it could have been, weather balloon perhaps. But I find interesting that there were no other reports during the years that base was in operation. There were no other reports of any kind of objects unusual being tracked on radar that we know of that were filed with Project Blue Book. The only other UFO report was one that was just a visual and was corroborated by other sightings of objects in the sky. It seemed to be not tracked on radar or anything. So out of all those years, how is it that same night is the only night when an alleged UFO was tracked on radar for 18 minutes before losing contact? And then a few hours later, this incident takes place in Franconia Notch. Could just be a completely crazy coincidence. Sure, that's possible. I just do find it very interesting to draw that sort of connection and say, hey, did something actually take place here? Perhaps. All right, as we move on, we've got the Brown Mountain Lights, more aerial phenomena. So this is definitely hinging on high strangeness. You've also got urban legend. You've got the story of the Brown Mountain Lights, which are tied to Brown Mountain, North Carolina, which is an area in the Linville Gorge, this kind of wilderness area in the mountains of North Carolina. Beautiful area. But they're these sort of weird Appalachian spook lights that have been described for centuries as these sorts of visuals. Brown Mountain Lights remain a mystery to viewers, seen primarily in Brown Mountain, but also Wiseman's View here, which is in a different area than Brown Mountain, very close to one another. And this is where the story gets kind of complicated. You have these stories of these lights seen. They're seen in the valley. They're seen at the top of the mountain. They're seen floating above the mountain. They're seen independently flying around. There's lots of different descriptions of what they are and where they're seen in this area, but they happen all in that kind of area. Now, is there some sort of paranormal explanation? That's what some have theorized. Is it just a natural explanation? Perhaps there's some sort of ball lightning that takes place in this one specific area of the southern Appalachians? That's a good question. We don't know. There's a lot of different kind of possibilities, right? There's also people say, people go there and they see what they want to see. They make up the stories. There are people that go and play the Brown Mountain Lights and launch fireworks just to mess with tourists. That's sort of the mystery there. So this is an alleged photo of some of the Brown Mountain Lights. And you can kind of see, it looks like they're floating. Now, some of the ones in the past have been explained away as, they were trains or car headlights seen in the distance. You even had a sign that used to be there. The long, even-crested mountain in the distance is Brown Mountain. From early times, people have observed weird wavering lights rising above this mountain, then dwindle and fade away. Now, I was there just a few months ago in the month of May. I was there with Joe and Jesse of Hellbent Holler. They're actually also presenting here at Anomicon. And we did a kind of experiment. We were filming what we believed there. You can see on the ridge with the Brown Mountain Lights. This is actually what we captured, these lights upon this ridge. And I don't want to give too much away, but we were able to do some really cool experimenting there, where we had one team in Wiseman's View and the other on Table Mountain doing an experiment with lights to see, are these the Brown Mountain Lights? Does this explain the Brown Mountain Lights? This is a daytime picture of the area. So very fascinating to see that sort of thing. We thought we were seeing the Brown Mountain Lights. Did we? I don't know. That's something in the experiment, we were able to kind of figure out what we were actually seeing. And again, there may be multiple phenomena going on here with the Brown Mountain Lights, and it all gets rolled into one in an urban legend, but it's part of that area. It's part of the folklore. It's really become part of the story there of the Linville Gorge area and that part of North Carolina. And this is going to be a future episode of Strange Places. I'm really excited to showcase people this because you have certain sightings. Joe and Jesse actually filmed objects that were flying well above the ridge, which raises another question of what is going on. Either way, it's captivated people for many years, and many people go there just to try and see the Brown Mountain Lights. And a lot of times, likely, they're seeing another hiker with their light, and that then becomes the Brown Mountain Lights. But there's a lot going on there, so that is a very fascinating kind of phenomena tied to a specific geographical area. And the last one we're going to cover tonight is something else, also the topic of a future upcoming Strange Places. It's called the Go Road in Northern California. A little bit of urban legend, a little bit of urbex, abandoned highway. As you can see the road there, it's considered to be a highway, but Many people are familiar with this photo right here. This is from the 1967 Patterson-Gimlin film, taken in Bluff Creek, Northern California. Arguably one of the most famous and interesting pieces of footage ever filmed, other than perhaps the Zapruder footage of the JFK. It's been analyzed and overanalyzed. Everyone's looked at it. Everyone knows this as Patty of the Patterson-Gimlin film. Very famous alleged Bigfoot footage. Still, to this day, considered to be one of the best pieces of footage of a Bigfoot-like creature in existence. And this area of Bluff Creek, Northern California, the rough wilderness there, is where a lot of the term Bigfoot came from. Late 1950s, even previously to the Patterson-Gimlin film, you had these tracks found out there by logging crews that were trying to punch into some of the virgin wilderness out there, and finding these tracks that were then labeled as Bigfoot by a journalist, and the story kind of took off from there. So most people are familiar with this story, and people that are into the Bigfoot topic or other paranormal things, they know about the Bigfoot topic. They've heard Bluff Creek, so associated with the events of the late 1950s, and this here, the Patterson-Gimlin film. Most people don't know that there is this abandoned highway that is basically the gateway into Bigfoot country. So the Go Road, called the Gasket-Orleans Road, the Gasky-Orleans Road, was actually intended to be a highway that would link the redwood coasts of California into the interior part of Northern California, and then be able to use that for logging, extraction. And what happened was the road was nearly completed. I mean, it was 55 miles long, and I believe it was all but like the last 10 or so were completed. Because in between the two areas, and this is how crazy it is. You can see with the visuals here, this is basically a highway that's going into this really desolate kind of wilderness. This is one end of the pavement. Now, what happened was there was a struggle there to try to get the road shut down, because there's a valley that the road would have gone through that's actually sacred to many of the Native American tribes in that area. And they had fought very, very tough to try to get this road shut down and stopped before it completely bulldozed through this sacred land of theirs, and actually was stopped, nearly completed. So this is one end of the pavement from the interior part of Northern California, and this is the part if you're coming from the redwoods. And you can drive to either end where the pavement ends, and there's about a 10-mile valley in between where there's a wilderness area. It's a designated protected wilderness area now, part of the Siskiyou Wilderness and the Six Rivers National Forest. And that is a very interesting area. It's, of course, like I said, it's very tied to the local tribes. It's very sacred to them. But it's very fascinating knowing that there's a highway basically in some of the most desolate wilderness in all of California that just ends on either end. And to get from one end to the other, it's almost a 4 to 5 hour drive. You either have to go north into southern Oregon or south to the Redwood Coast and then up from there. And we did, actually, while I was there. This was back in July. I was there, and we hiked from one end of the pavement to the other. Here's another photo. You can kind of see it's very high elevation, just beautiful views on this highway. Just knowing you're in such a desolate area, and it's just an incredible place. Nature, of course, has done its number on the road, and the road is sort of a reminder of a period where the resource extraction was seen as more important than protecting the land, and that, of course, has changed since then. This is some of the territory in between the Go Road there. We actually did the entire back from one end of the pavement, essentially, to the other and back hike overnight, just to kind of document that wilderness in between and how beautiful it is and how interesting it is. And it's very tied to the Bigfoot subject. As myself there in this wilderness area. And the one side of the Go Road, I mean, when most people are going to Bluff Creek, when they want to go visit the Patterson-Gimlin film site or Louse Camp or any of the areas at Bluff Creek that are known for alleged Bigfoot activity going back to the 50s, they drive in from the town of Orleans there to Bluff Creek on the Go Road. So they go on the Go Road, and multiple Bigfoot encounters have happened on the Go Road. While we were out there, we visited a location where there were some fairly recent tracks in the last couple of years found in the snow on the Go Road. They were very convincing. We also met with James Bobo Fay of Finding Bigfoot, who had a potential sighting while on the Go Road as they were doing an operation there in the early 2000s with some speakers and call blasting alleged audio to try to entice any potential Bigfoot activity, and he had some sort of a sighting while out there. So the Goat Road is integrally tied into the lore of Bigfoot country. It truly is an abandoned highway in the middle of Bigfoot country. Very unusual. Not a lot of people know about it. You wouldn't really know about it unless you were interested in this topic and you decided to travel to the area. And then you say, why? My first impression driving there a few years ago, going to Bluff Creek for the first time, was why are we on a paved road? I thought this was a wilderness and wild area. And then you hear the story of the Goat Road and how unusual it was, how it was very close to being completed and then was shut down. I mean, look at it on Google Earth and you'll see what I'm talking about. Each end of the road, they just come to an end in this wilderness area. The amount of effort just to get that far and to have to be shut down. And of course, thankfully, the preservation of not only this beautiful land, but sacred land to many of the tribes that reside there in Northern California. It's just a story. It's a very fascinating, somewhat unusual story, and this will be all covered in a future episode of Strange Places that I'm very excited to showcase. There's another beautiful shot there of the Goat Road. So there you have it, folks. I've rambled enough for you tonight. That is the story of Strange Places and kind of an examination of what makes some of these places strange. These are just a lot of my observations and some of the places I've chosen to highlight, and hopefully it all makes sense. I think there's a lot of different categories and things that fall into the topic of what can be a strange place. It doesn't necessarily have to be associated with a cryptid story or some sort of other mystery. There's just the pure and usual nature of how something was abandoned or the way it is. That's how I approach the topic. That's how I've approached the series. And I'm really excited to showcase some of the stuff I've had happen. If you're interested in seeing any of these episodes, go to the Small Town Monsters YouTube channel and look up in playlists. You can find Strange Places, or you can just search it in a tab, and it'll come up with the episodes that are out so far. There's quite a few of them. They're all about an hour or so long, from the LBL to some of the stuff that's going to be upcoming. There's just a lot of really interesting content. I've been really blessed to travel to some of these places, and I'm glad to have shared some of them with you tonight. So without further ado, thank you guys so much for listening, and hopefully you enjoy the rest of Anomicon. I know there's some awesome speakers, and I just want to thank Ryan Sprague and everybody who set up Anomicon. Thank you for the opportunity to share my presentation. Thank you.